When Nazi concentration camps are discussed, most people imagine male SS officers carrying out the violence. But as the war continued, something far darker began taking shape inside the Ravensbruck, the camp where female guards were no longer simply overseeing prisoners. And when the war finally ended, what investigators uncovered about these women shocked the whole world. Ravensbrück was built in 1939 near a lake about 50 miles north of Berlin, in a quiet part of northeastern Germany. What made it different from most Nazi camps was that it was created specifically for women. By 1939, the Nazis already had many camps, but Ravensbrück became the main camp for imprisoning women the regime saw as enemies. That included Jewish women, political prisoners, Roma women, resistance fighters from across occupied Europe, Jehovah's Witnesses, and women the Nazis called asocial. That label was deliberately vague and could mean anything from homelessness to being in a relationship the regime didn't approve of. What truly made Ravensbrück stand out was the people who worked there. The SS didn't use a complicated process to recruit female guards. Starting in 1939, they placed newspaper ads and spread information through job offices targeting young women looking for work. The job paid better than factory labor and also included housing, meals, and a uniform. For many working-class women in a country dealing with war and economic hardship, those benefits mattered. The main requirement was being German and meeting the Nazi racial standards. No police experience was needed. There was no psychological check or background screening to see if someone was fit for the job. In the early years, training lasted only a few weeks. Later in the war, when the SS needed more guards quickly, training became even shorter. New recruits were usually placed beside experienced guards and shown how the camp worked. Part of that training included normalizing violence. Beating prisoners was not only allowed, it was treated as a normal way to show authority. Guards who hesitated were pressured. Guards who acted brutally were often even rewarded with better positions. Across the Nazi camp system, about 3,500 women served as guards during the war, and most of them started at Ravensbrück. The camp worked like a training pipeline. Women trained there before being sent to camps and subcamps across occupied Europe. By 1944, around 150 female guards were stationed at Ravensbrück at one time, controlling a prisoner population that sometimes reached 45,000 to 50,000 women. That system only worked because of fear. Prisoners who resisted faced immediate and violent punishment, and everyone knew it. Among those 150 guards, a few became so cruel that survivors from different countries later gave almost identical descriptions of their actions, even though they'd never spoken to each other after the war. One of them was Dorothea Binz, who arrived at Ravensbrück in 1939 as a 19-year-old domestic worker, someone hired to clean and cook. But within a year, she applied to become an Aufseherin, a guard. Over time, she climbed the ranks and eventually became the Oberaufseherin, the chief female overseer of the camp. That made her the senior woman in charge of the other female guards and gave her major control over prisoners' daily lives. Binz personally beat prisoners on a regular basis, not as punishment for specific actions, but simply as a display of power. She kept a dog that she used against prisoners. She also forced prisoners to stand through long roll calls in freezing weather for hours, even when the counting itself only took minutes. Survivors believe she did it because she enjoyed watching exhausted and starving women suffer. Binz was also in a relationship with a senior SS officer named Edmund Browning, and survivors describe both of them as equally indifferent to prisoner suffering. Another woman was Carmen Mori. Her story was even more disturbing in some ways. Mori wasn't originally a guard. She was a Swiss prisoner at Ravensbrück, with a complicated wartime background linked to intelligence work. Reports claimed she had worked as a spy for both German and French intelligence at different times. At some point, the SS saw her as useful and gave her a position called Blockalteste, a prisoner placed in charge of other prisoners inside a barrack block. The SS used this system on purpose because it created prisoner-on-prisoner control inside the camp. Mori used her position to beat sick and dying women in the infirmary, including prisoners too weak to even defend themselves. Survivors also testified that she personally killed at least one prisoner. Many prisoners feared her deeply because she was technically one of them, and should have understood exactly what they were going through. One more female guard's name that comes up is Vera Salvquart. She was a Czech nurse who worked in the camp's infirmary, known as the Revier. Officially, the Revier was meant to help sick prisoners recover. In reality, it became a place where prisoners considered too weak to work were sent. Survivors described Salvquart giving patients a white powder mixed into their food without explanation. Women who received it often died shortly afterwards. Salvquart later claimed it was only some kind of harmless supplement, but survivor accounts and the repeated pattern of deaths suggested otherwise. By late 1944, it was becoming obvious that Germany was losing the war. The Soviet Red Army had been pushing west after its victory at the Battle of Kursk in 1943, retaking Soviet territory and moving into Poland. Allied forces had landed in Normandy in June 1944 and were advancing through France. As Nazi territory collapsed, SS officials knew their crimes would soon be exposed, and they began deciding what to do with both the evidence and the prisoners. At Ravensbrück, the answer was just to kill faster. The SS built a gas chamber near the camp crematorium. It was smaller and more improvised than the massive killing facilities at Auschwitz-Birkenau, but it worked well enough for what the SS wanted during the final months of the war. Prisoners were selected in larger numbers and told they were being transferred to a recovery center called Mittwerda. This place did not exist. Instead, the women were taken to the gas chamber, killed, and then cremated. Historians estimate that between 5,000 and 6,000 women were murdered this way between January and April 1945 alone. Guards like beans directly took place in these selections. Prisoners were lined up while guards walked through the rows deciding who would live and who would die. Sometimes the choices were based on visible illness. Other times they seemed completely random. Survivors described women being selected simply because they had upset a guard earlier or because they happened to stand in the wrong place. The selections became another form of total power, and some guards used that power without hesitation. At the same time, the camp became dangerously overcrowded. Prisoners from camps farther east began arriving on foot as Soviet prisoners approached places like Auschwitz. The SS evacuated those camps by forcing prisoners on long winter marches westward. Marches now known as death marches, because thousands died from starvation, freezing temperatures, and shootings along the way. Many survivors of those marches ended up at Ravensbrück, overwhelming a camp that was already far beyond capacity. Disease spread quickly through the packed barracks, and food supplies became even smaller as Germany's military situation collapsed. In April 1945, with Soviet troops only days away, the SS evacuated most of the remaining prisoners on another forced march westward. Guards shot women who fell behind or couldn't keep up. On April 30th, the same day Adolf Hitler killed himself in his Berlin bunker, Soviet soldiers reached Ravensbrück. They found a nearly empty camp still holding several thousand women who were too sick to move. 8 days later, on May 8th, the war in Europe officially ended. Just days earlier than that, many SS members threw away their uniforms, burned documents, and disappeared into the millions of refugees and civilians moving through a destroyed Germany. Some used fake names, some received help from organized escape networks. In some cases, people connected to the Catholic Church helped Nazi figures escape to South America through routes that later became known as rat lines. Many others simply returned home and waited to see if anyone would come looking for them. British forces ended up taking the main role in investigating Ravensbrück and tracking down the people who'd worked there. One reason was that many prisoners at the camp had been British and Western European women, especially French and Dutch resistance fighters who'd been arrested and deported by the Germans. In the summer of 1945, the British War Crimes Investigation Team started interviewing survivors. What investigators heard was both detailed and deeply damaging. Women who had survived Ravensbrück and returned to France, Poland, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union all described many of the same guards, the same acts of violence, and the same behavior patterns. These women had no way to coordinate their stories, yet their testimonies matched in specific and verifiable ways. Dorothea Binz was arrested in May 1945 near the town of Güstrow in northeastern Germany, only days after Germany officially surrendered. She was just 25 years old. According to people who witnessed the arrest, Binz appeared calm and showed very little concern. She seemed to believe that she hadn't done anything serious enough to lead to major punishment. That strange disconnect from reality later became a common pattern among many former camp staff after the war. Carmen Mori was found in Switzerland and handed over to British authorities. Her case was more complicated because of her intelligence background. There were different claims about who she'd worked for during the war and what exactly her role had been. But none of that changed the evidence connected to her actions inside Ravensbruck. The testimony about her behavior stood on its own. Vera Salvkort was captured in Germany and identified by several survivors who recognized her from the medical block. The women who testified about her gave very detailed descriptions of what they'd seen. Their stories matched closely enough to create a clear picture of what had happened. By late 1946, British investigators believed they had gathered enough evidence to move forward with prosecutions. And the first Ravensbrück trial opened on December 5, 1946, before a British military tribunal in Hamburg. It was part of the larger British effort to prosecute war crimes committed against citizens of Allied countries. Ravensbrück had held huge numbers of French, Dutch, Polish, Soviet, and British women, many of them resistance fighters who'd been captured while fighting against the German occupation of their countries. 16 defendants stood trial in that first case. Among them were Beans, Mori, Salvkort, and several other guards and SS officers, including men who had held leadership positions inside the camp. The most important male defendant was Fritz Sören, who had served as a camp commandant from 1942 onward and had been the highest-ranking SS officer at Ravensbrück during its deadliest years. At the end of the war, Sören fled and tried surrendering to American forces, likely believing American custody would be safer than British or French custody. But he was eventually handed over and included in the legal proceedings. The defendants were charged with war crimes. These charges included murdering Allied nationals, taking part in torture and inhumane treatment, and helping run the system that made mass murder at Ravensbrück possible. Prosecutors presented testimony from dozens of survivors who directly identified specific defendants and described in detail what they'd personally seen those people do inside the camp. Defense lawyers tried several different arguments. The most common was the claim that the defendants had simply been following orders inside a military-style chain of command and could not be personally responsible for actions ordered from above. Another argument focused specifically on the female defendants. Lawyers claimed these women had been trapped inside a male-controlled Nazi system and were themselves victims in some sense because they had not created the system and couldn't realistically resist it. The defense hoped the tribunal would show sympathy because they were women operating under orders in a brutal dictatorship. The prosecution rejected both arguments. Earlier that same year, the Nuremberg trials had already ruled that following orders was not a full defense for war crimes. Individual responsibility still existed, especially when someone's actions went beyond what any order required. Prosecutors at the Ravensbrück trial applied the same idea here. No order forced Binns to make starving prisoners stand outside for hours in freezing temperatures simply to increase their suffering. No order forced Salvkort to give suspicious substances to sick patients who appeared to be recovering. The verdict was announced on February 3, 1947. 11 of the 16 defendants were found guilty. Several of them, including Binns, Mori, and Salvkort, received death sentences. The others received long prison terms. The executions were not automatic, and the tribunal did not hand them down casually. The judges believed the punishment had to match the scale and brutality of the crimes. And understanding why they reached that conclusion means understanding what the evidence actually showed. The executions took place on May 2, 1947, at Hamelin prison in northern Germany. This was the prison the British used for carrying out death sentences against convicted war criminals after the war. Dorothea Binns was 27 years old when she was hanged. Reports from prison staff and officials who saw her during her final days described her as calm and mostly unrepentant. She reportedly described her actions as service to her country. In a grim way, that statement revealed how deeply Nazi ideology still shaped the way she saw herself. Carmen Mori was never executed. The night before her scheduled hanging, she died in her prison cell after using a sharp object to take her own life. The exact details were never fully explained. For many survivors waiting for justice, her death created mixed emotions. She escaped the execution ordered by the tribunal, but at the same time her suicide seemed like a final confirmation of guilt. Vera Salvcourt was hanged alongside Binz on May 2nd. During the months before her execution, she continued writing letters claiming she was innocent, but the tribunal's judgment never changed. Between 1946 and 1958, British military tribunals held 3 separate Ravensbrück trials as investigators continued gathering and organizing evidence. In total, 16 death sentences were handed down, though only 14 were eventually carried out. The number dropped because of Mori's suicide and because one sentence was later reduced after an appeal. Fritz Sören, who had been separated from the first trial for different legal proceedings, was later tried by a French military tribunal and executed in June 1950. Several other defendants across all 3 Ravensbrück trials received prison sentences ranging from a few years to life imprisonment. Out of the tens of thousands of women who survived Ravensbrück and the death marches of 1945, many returned home to countries that did not really know how to deal with them. In France, the post-war national story focused heavily on resistance heroes and liberation. While that story was real, it left little space for the darker reality of women who had spent years starving, freezing, and being beaten inside concentration camps. In Poland and the Soviet Union, survivors returned to governments that controlled wartime memory very carefully, promoting some stories while ignoring others for political reasons. Many survivors discovered that people around them either couldn't handle hearing what had happened or simply didn't want to hear it in detail. Some women faced disbelief. Others were met with silence or obvious discomfort. Many eventually decided it was easier not to talk about the camp at all. Some stayed silent for 20 or 30 years before speaking publicly. One group of Polish survivors later became extremely important in the history of medical ethics. These women had been used in surgical experiments by SS doctors at Ravensbrück. The experiments were designed to imitate battlefield wounds and infections. Doctors cut open the women's legs, infected the wounds with bacteria, and then tested treatments on them. The women were never told what was happening, were given no choice, and received almost no proper medical care afterward. The women later called themselves the rabbits, a bitter reference to laboratory animals. Several of them testified during the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1946 and 1947, where 20 SS doctors were prosecuted for medical crimes committed across Nazi camps. The testimony from the Ravensbrück rabbits directly helped shape the Nuremberg Code, a set of ethical rules for medical experiments that required voluntary consent from patients and research subjects. The Nuremberg Code later became one of the foundations of modern medical ethics and is still referenced today. Germaine Tillion was another important survivor. She'd been arrested for resistance activity and deported to Ravensbrück in 1943. Before the war, she had trained as an ethnographer and researcher, and inside the camp, she carefully observed and mentally recorded what she witnessed whenever possible. After liberation, she wrote one of the earliest and most detailed accounts of Ravensbrück. Her work became extremely important because it helped establish the historical record at a time when some people were already beginning to question or deny parts of the Holocaust. Tillion later became a major intellectual figure in France and spent much of the rest of her life making sure Ravensbrück was not forgotten. She died in 2008 at the age of 100. Today, the site of Ravensbrück is a memorial and museum called the Mann- und Gedenkstätte Ravensbrück, located in the town of Fürstenberg-Havel in northeastern Germany. The memorial preserves archives, runs educational programs, and receives visitors from around the world. But standing there now, it's hard to fully connect the quiet landscape with what once happened on the same grounds. The barracks are mostly gone, the noise is gone, and the routines of the camp are long finished. Yet the place still holds what was done there in a way no document or trial record ever quite manages to replace.